Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Chris, I want to give you, I don't know, a little props, a little bolstering, a little emotional support as your friend for the hollering that you just did about what is going on with the measles outbreaks in Texas and elsewhere. I have very rarely heard you just full on open your lungs and holler on TV, but if there was ever an occasion to do it, that was it, man.
I gotta say, like, a lot of things in politics and policy are complicated with like complicated trade-offs, and this just isn't one of them. And there's more kids who are gonna die, and it's just so upsetting to watch it happen.
Yes, I mean, we've already got the first, with that kid who's died in Texas, that's the first measles death we've had in this country in a decade. Meanwhile, the numbers of people who are infected with measles rising mercilessly every day now in 8 or 9 states, and we've got an HHS secretary whose best idea is cod liver oil. I mean, it is worth screaming about. I'm glad you did.
Thank you.
Thanks, my friend. And thanks, Shubham, for joining us this hour. Really happy to have you here. All right, have you ever been at the beach and seen a Coast Guard helicopter doing Coast Guard helicopter things, like on the at the beach or at the seaside? My dad, God bless him, he's like a savant when it comes to identifying planes and helicopters. In every other way, my dad seems like a normal man, but you'll be talking to him and there's some tiny fly speck on the horizon that you can't even hear and you can barely see, and he'll whip around and say, "Ooh, a DC-7, I think that was built in 1978. or he'll be like, "Oh, I didn't realize that Satopria was still flying out of that airfield. I haven't seen that there in a few years." Like, Dad, how do you know this stuff? I've always been very impressed with my dad that he could do that, and a little embarrassed that I can't. But when it comes to Coast Guard helicopters specifically, at least those, I can usually say, hey, that's one from the Coast Guard. It's because they're usually painted in very bright, distinctive, like orange and white. But also, unless you're around a bunch of other military aircraft for some reason, they are usually bigger and way more serious looking than anything else that might be flying around, like than any news helicopter or tourist sightseeing helicopter, anything like that. They're really recognizable. The most recognizable helicopter that you see for things like Coast Guard search and rescue and Coast Guard law enforcement missions is this one you see here, the CH-65 Dolphin. And that one, once I point this out, every time you see one, you'll know exactly what it is. Because it's not only got the normal helicopter rotor on top, it's also got this distinctive vertical tail rotor as well, that circular tail rotor. It's unmistakable. It's a really big aircraft, and ones like this, they really stand out. But did you know, if you need to, you can stuff one of those huge orange Coast Guard helicopters inside another aircraft. You can take that helicopter and put it inside another aircraft. It's like a turducken. Look, this is one of those big Coast Guard search and rescue helicopters being put inside another aircraft, being put inside a Coast Guard C-130. Just to give you some idea of how big a Coast Guard C-130 is. That's how huge that plane is. You could put a whole helicopter inside it. One of the big ones. C-130s can carry whole helicopters. C-130s are so big, they can carry 6-wheeled armored U.S. military vehicles. C-130s can carry more than 21 tons of cargo and airdrop it wherever you need, anywhere in the world. C-130s are just massive. For U.S. military transport, they have no trouble hauling more than 90 fully equipped U.S. troops plus all their gear anywhere in the world. They're just massive. They're like airplane hangars that are also airplanes. Last week, the Trump administration sent the U.S. Secretary of Defense and a Fox News host and a Fox News Channel camera crew all the way to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba to be there for the arrival of a C-130. To be there for the arrival of one of these C-130 military aircraft, one of these huge cargo planes landing at Guantanamo with very important cargo on board. They landed one of these huge military aircraft there, this one that can hold more than 20 tons of gear. It can carry multiple armored vehicles. It can carry whole helicopters in its belly. They landed one of these huge planes there, and out popped 9 guys. A total of 9 people that they flew to Guantanamo on an active duty U.S. military aircraft with massive cargo capacity. Presumably because they wanted it to look like a big operation. After all, they had the 7 p.m. host from the Fox News channel there and the defense secretary there in person. So this thing had to look big. But I kid you not, there were only 9 guys inside that whole huge plane. When you use a plane like that to fly 9 people into a Fox News photo op, you know what that is? That's a really expensive photo op. And if you think that C-130 was a little big for that job, consider that the Trump administration, in its infinite wisdom, in its relentless search for efficiency, they not only have been using C-130s for flights like this, they have also been using C-17s, which are an order of magnitude bigger. In a C-17, you can't just fit one helicopter inside. You can fit whole fleets of helicopters inside them. You can roll 8 Humvees into a C-17 all at once. You can put a 70-ton M1 Abrams tank in there and drop it anywhere you want. C-17s are just unimaginably enormous. And the Trump administration, again, I kid you not, has also been using C-17s, according to the Wall Street Journal, approximately 30 times to fly random little groups of immigrants to different places. For a flight, say, to India, they charged the taxpayers $3 million for a single flight on one of these military aircraft, just so they could do it using one of these huge planes. Cost for using one of these big military planes at minimum is like over $28,000 an hour. But that's what they're doing. That's what they're using it for. Why are they doing this? Why are they wasting all of this money and all of these military resources, active duty military resources? Quote, the administration has opted for military planes for these flights, quote, for reasons of optics, said one U.S. defense official. Optics. Gotta get the photo op right. Tell me more about all the waste, fraud, and abuse you're targeting by firing the people who contain Ebola outbreaks, while you're using C-17s and C-130s to fly. You used a C-130 to fly 9 guys to a Fox News photo op. You could have fit those guys in 2 Nissan Sentras with a seat left over. But no, they spent on that one flight nearly $250,000 taxpayer dollars for that one trip, so it would look very militaristic and cool and tough on the Fox News 7 p.m. show with Laura Ingraham. Hey, that's your money that they spent on that. The Wall Street Journal was first to report today that the Trump administration is finally now, quote, suspending costly deportation flights using U.S. military aircraft. Quote, the Trump administration has conducted roughly 30 migrant flights using C-17 aircraft and about a dozen on C-130s, according to flight tracking data. The military flights have taken longer routes and transported fewer migrants at higher cost to taxpayers than the government's typical deportation flights on civilian aircraft. Alongside that, reporting from the Wall Street Journal today, NBC News is now reporting that the whole sending people to Guantanamo thing is off as well. Quote, President Donald Trump's plan to use the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba to detain 30,000 immigrants has been hitting major legal, logistical, and financial hurdles ever since he surprised many in his own administration by announcing it. Now, as agencies spar over responsibility for operations there and over blame for what has gone wrong, there is a growing recognition within the administration that this was a political decision that is, quote, just not working. The Pentagon is also discussing bringing home some of the more than 1,000 U.S. troops who were surged to Guantanamo in the first days after Trump's announcement. You might remember that Trump announced that they were going to fill up Guantanamo with 30,000 bad guys. Remember he said it was going to be the worst of the worst? The largest number of people they sent was 178, all of whom were quickly shipped out to somewhere else. More than a quarter of the people they had there at the time when they had the highest numbers there, more than a quarter of the people they had sent there had zero criminal record and zero criminal charges pending against them. The worst of the worst. Got to put them there with Al Qaeda. And we're going to have 30,000 of them. And we're going to drop them off on 5 motorcycles. Really? But apparently that's done now. You know, it was never clearly legal for them to be using U.S. military resources for these flights or for what they were having the military try to do with these folks at Guantanamo. But they nevertheless announced it. They made a bunch of social media videos out of it and Fox News hits. And now they can't get away with it for any longer. And so now they're just quietly no longer doing it and not saying anything about it. We are barely 6 weeks in, and this already is quite the thing. They are trying all sorts of incredibly reckless, incredibly expensive, incredibly ill-advised things. And then those things fail because they can't work or because they can't handle the pushback against them, or they face lawsuits and court orders because these things are obviously illegal, or they're just too stupid to live. And so then they stop doing these things and they cave and they try to pretend they weren't doing them at all. We're only 6 weeks in and we're already seeing this for military flights for deportations and sending immigrants to Guantanamo for some reason, right? Those things already appear to be over as of today. Also this one, today. Headline, Trump agency pulls 443 sites off market in real estate reversal. Real estate reversal, what? This is from Bloomberg News, quote, at 2 p.m. Tuesday, so yesterday, the GSA posted a list of 443 properties it was considering for sale, an inventory that ranged from a toll booth in El Paso to the FDA's research campus in Silver Spring, Maryland. In the next 5 hours, more than 100 of those 443 properties were removed from the catalog, including the agency headquarters of the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Justice, the Department of Labor, and the VA. By this morning, less than 24 hours later, the entire list had been removed. Quote, the about face capped a stunning 18 hours that shook federal agencies and threatened already wobbly commercial real estate markets. The sale of some of these properties could have created unique problems. The inventory of properties for disposal included, for example, one specialized satellite facility for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Maryland. Also, a 3.1 million square foot FDA research lab. Also, get this, look at this. A Northern Virginia campus that doesn't appear in federal property records, but has long been associated with the Central Intelligence Agency. They tried to sell the CIA. The president had his top campaign donor try to sell the CIA. And the headquarters building of the Department of Justice, and the headquarters of the VA, and the specialist satellite facilities without which we cannot have, I don't know, weather forecasts. They tried that yesterday, and then, oops, pushback. Who could have expected? And so then today, less than 24 hours later, they took it all back. They took them all down. Trump tried to fire the chief of the Merit Systems Protection Board. A court ordered her reinstated. Today, that Merit Systems Protection Board ordered the reinstatement of more than 5,000 people who work for the USDA, for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. 5,000 people who were illegally mass fired by Trump. Those more than 5,000 people must now be reinstated for at least the next 45 days. That ruling comes after Trump tried to fire another person he's not allowed to fire, Hampton Dellinger, who heads up the federal office that oversees whistleblower protections and civil service protections. Trump tried to fire him too. That is apparently illegal. Dellinger has fought it vociferously in the courts, including one trip already to the Supreme Court, and it looks like another trip to the Supreme Court is probably on the way. But in the meantime, while he has been reinstated, he told the Merit Systems Protection Board to weigh in on the mass firings at USDA, which appeared to be blatantly illegal. That board did weigh in on them. They had to fight their own firings along the way to get there, but they fought them, and now those more than 5,000 workers at USDA must be reinstated. A ruling by a federal judge in California on the illegality of mass firings carried out by Trump's Office of Personnel Management. That ruling appears to have stopped Trump for now from going ahead with his plan to fire more than 5,000 people from the Department of Defense. Quote, the Pentagon's planned firing of 5,400 employees has been temporarily delayed after a federal court decision blocking such dismissals. Same thing at the National Science Foundation. The director of the National Science Foundation has ordered 84 of the 170 employees who were laid off from that agency last month to be reinstated immediately. The reversal comes in response to a federal judge's ruling that the Trump administration exceeded its authority when it outlined steps to fire an estimated 200,000 federal workers. Same vibe, different explanation, or rather sort of lack of an explanation when it comes to people fired from the CDC. Quote, emails went out Tuesday to about 180 CDC employees who got termination notices last month. A message was sent with the subject line, quote, read this email immediately. It said, quote, after further review and consideration, a February 15th termination notice has been rescinded. Employees were told they were cleared to return to work today, Wednesday. Quote, you should return to duty under your previous work schedule. We apologize for any disruption that this may have caused. Associated Press notes, quote, the CDC is just the latest federal agency trying to coax back workers soon after they were fired. Similar reversals have been made among employees responsible for medical device oversight, food safety, bird flu response, nuclear weapons, and national parks. So, military flights for deportations? No. Sending random immigrants to Guantanamo like they're Al-Qaeda or something? No. Selling the CIA? No. And the Justice Department and the VA and every other federal building they can find in the phone book? No. Firing the guy who's in charge of whistleblowers? No. Firing the Merit Systems Protection Board? No. Firing 5,000 people at USDA? No. The firings at the National Science Foundation and the CDC and the Pentagon? No. Not all of them, at least. Not as many as can be stopped. And then there was today at the United States Supreme Court an unsigned, mealy-mouthed, mild-mannered, seemingly deliberately obtuse and confusing little ruling from the United States Supreme Court. That I mentioned it was unsigned, but it nevertheless did brush Trump back. Supreme Court today allowed to stand that court ruling we covered here last week, in which Trump was ordered to restart foreign aid funding that was approved by law that he had nevertheless illegally stopped. The federal judge had ordered Trump to restart that funding. Trump had not done it despite the judge's order. Then last week on Wednesday, that judge issued a motion to enforce, to compel the government to actually follow his order and restart that funding. And that deadline for them to restart that funding was Thursday at midnight. Thursday, just before midnight, Trump rushed to the Supreme Court to try to get them to rescue him from that deadline. And they did say they would consider it. They considered it Friday midday. And then they sat on it Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night. Who knows? Maybe they were waiting till Trump did his State of the Union thing last night. But then this morning, after the State of the Union, they slid this thing under the door. An unsigned, as I say, mealy-mouthed, mild-mannered little court order that nevertheless does require Donald Trump to start that funding. He cannot blow that judge off. The ruling was 5-4. Chief Justice John Roberts and Trump-appointed Justice Amy Coney Barrett siding with Elena Kagan, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and Sonia Sotomayor. in telling Trump no. In terms of what happens next, both sides in that case, the Trump administration and the plaintiffs, they're going to have to file a joint status report by 11 a.m. tomorrow in the courtroom of the judge who told the Trump administration they need to restart that funding. They need to file a joint status report tomorrow at 11 a.m. saying what they're going to do. But the Supreme Court has weighed in on this now, and they are not, as yet, on this, letting Trump just blatantly break the law. So we'll see what happens tomorrow at 11. But, no rush, right? No rush in restarting this funding. I mean, among other things, the Supreme Court's been sitting on it for nearly a week. And that funding is still stopped. I mean, in the meantime, this morning, people were arrested on Capitol Hill outside a meeting between a Trump State Department official and members of Congress. These people got arrested protesting the fact that HIV treatment still isn't restarted, even though the Trump administration keeps saying that that's one of the things that they agree shouldn't be cut off, and they agree that should get a waiver, and they agree that funding should be flowing. It's not fun. It's not flowing. It's not happening. And so these people today were on Capitol Hill, engaged in civil disobedience, getting arrested to try to get that funding pried loose, to keep people alive. Pushback comes in all sorts of ways. Lawsuits, court orders, individual officials refusing to go quietly and fighting personally as high as they possibly can to keep standing the systems and protections inside our government that are supposed to protect us and protect the American government from arbitrary and corrupt lawless action. There is friction and resistance inside the government and in the U.S. military when people are being asked to do things that are expensive and pointless and wasteful and embarrassing and ultimately indefensible, even when they happen on Fox News at 7 o'clock. There is journalism and therefore public attention to the indefensible costs and consequences of some of their most hurtful and ill-advised decisions. The local news coverage, for example, of the cost to American families and especially to American small businesses of Trump's this tariff stunt that he's pulling. The local news coverage of this has just been devastating. And it is unavoidable. It is in red states and blue states all across this country, in cities and small towns and anywhere there is a news outlet. And so, yes, today they've started to say, okay, maybe not on some of these tariffs. We will have more on that coming up tonight. But it's also very brave people, very relentless and brave people protesting, engaging in civil disobedience. People are willing to be arrested if necessary. It's also people peacefully protesting in the streets. Look, this was Boise, Idaho yesterday. This is at the capital of one of the most conservative states in the country. This is Boise, Idaho. People protesting against Trump in the lead up to his State of the Union address last night. This was Phoenix, Arizona yesterday. Another big crowd protesting at their state capitol ahead of Trump's speech last night. Look at the numbers that turned out yesterday in Utah, in Salt Lake City, Utah. Look at this. Utah, bright red Utah. Look at the people who turned out in Little Corning, New York, and in Bakersfield, California, and in West Hartford, Connecticut, and outside the office of the Office of Personnel Management in Washington, D.C. Pushback takes all forms. And it has turned them back, or at least slowed them down, on almost everything they have tried to do already. And it's easy to get overwhelmed with what they're trying to do, but look also at what they have been stopped from doing, what they have been slowed down from doing, what they've been embarrassed over, and what they've had to quietly claw back, hoping no one notices. I mean, they're clearly bent on an authoritarian takeover and destruction of the U.S. government, right? There's no illusions now as to what they're trying to do. They know they need to go fast if they are going to go far. Today, the headline showed the increasing scope of their appetite, right? To try to destroy more and do it more thoroughly. They want to fire 80,000 people from the VA, and they'll tell you they love veterans while they're doing it. The firing of 80,000 people from the VA, among other things, will be the firing of tens of thousands of veterans themselves who hold those jobs. But they're going to try it. See how much of that they can get away with. They said today they want to fire 40,000 plus people from the IRS. Because what better way to grind a country into dust than to eliminate the means by which it collects funds so it can continue to operate? If last night's State of the Union and the latest pronouncements from the president's top campaign donor are anything to go by, it would seem that they're about to come next for Social Security. So the VA, the IRS, Social Security. And then tonight there's this. Reopening the immigration prison where they locked up all the little kids. Quote, the Trump administration is reopening a sprawling detention center in South Texas for migrant families facing deportation, resuming the practice of detaining children 4 years after the Biden administration ended it. Everywhere they go, everything they have tried to do, they are running up against opposition and annoyance. They are running up against their own stupidity. They are running up against their own ignorance. They are running up against the law. They are running up against journalists figuring out what they are doing. They are running up against the revelation that the American people really dislike what they are doing, and people are willing to let that be known. They are running up against constituents, even Republican constituents, people who live in bright red districts and states, telling their members of Congress and their senators how much they dislike what Trump is doing. They're running up against people protesting against it. The pushback all over this country has thrown down stop strips in the road to flatten their tires and at least slow them down and sometimes to stop them. And it has happened everywhere. And none of it has been easy, given the scale of what they are trying to do to this country. But the feedback loop here is very clear 6 weeks in. It is working, and redoubled efforts will mean redoubled results. We've got a lot more to come on that tonight, plus one big warning for something to watch for that is coming. That's all I had. Stay with us.